The day began like any other. The sun was warm, but gentle. Casting golden light across the streets, birds called from the rooftops. And children laughed as they ran down the sidewalks after school. For most people, it was just another ordinary afternoon, and for the girl, it felt the same. She carried her backpack over one shoulder, her headphones in. Humming softly to the music that filled her ears, she walked at an easy pace, enjoying the rhythm of her steps on the pavement. The breeze played with her hair, lifting strands lightly across her face. She didn't rush, there was no reason to. She had finished her classes for the day, greeted her friends with laughter, and now looked forward to the comfort of home. Maybe she would grab a snack, maybe scroll through her phone, maybe tell her dad about her day if he was back early. The neighborhood was familiar. Safe in her eyes, she knew these streets, these shops, the people who waved as she passed by. The corner store owner gave her a nod as she went by, and she smiled back politely. This was the kind of ordinary routine that made her feel grounded, stable, normal. Her mind drifted as she walked, thinking about the small things teenagers often think about: homework she hadn't finished yet, a funny message from a friend, the new shoes she wanted to buy. Her music filled her head, drowning out the noise of traffic, the voices of people around. It was her little world, peaceful and unbothered. But what she didn't know was that this ordinary day was about to twist sharply. The quiet rhythm of her steps would soon be interrupted. The peace she carried would soon be shattered. And she, a girl simply walking home, would suddenly find herself at the center of a storm she had never asked for. She adjusted her backpack and crossed the street, her eyes briefly catching the glow of the setting sun reflecting off car windows. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and she smiled faintly. She loved animals, but her parents had always said no to pets. Still, she promised herself that one day, when she had her own place, she would have one, maybe a dog, maybe a cat. Her phone buzzed with a message, and she glanced at it quickly. It was a reminder about a group project due next week. She sighed, tucking the phone back into her pocket. Later, she told herself, for now, all she wanted was to enjoy the walk, the soft music, and the simple joy of being outside. Her sneakers tapped against the concrete as she turned another corner. She waved at a neighbor, watering plants on their porch. The woman waved back warmly, calling out, "Be safe, dear." The girl nodded with a smile, her headphones muffling the words, but her heart recognizing the kindness. To her, it was an ordinary day because nothing seemed unusual. The world looked the same, sounded the same, and felt the same. She had no reason to expect otherwise. She didn't notice the police car parked a little further down the street, didn't pay attention to the officers leaning against it. There, eyes scanning the road lazily, she was too focused on her song, too lost in the moment to realize that fate was shifting. She walked with the ease of someone who trusted her surroundings. She thought about dinner and wondered what her mother might cook tonight. She thought about calling her father later to ask if he was home early, maybe to tell him about a funny thing that had happened in class. She thought about normal things, small things, the kind of things people take for granted. And that was the beauty of it, the simplicity of life, the innocence of an ordinary day. She had no idea that her calm walk home would soon become a story, told and retold. She had no idea that the next few minutes would pull her into a confrontation that would test her strength, expose injustice, and awaken a power hidden in her family's name. Her footsteps slowed as she approached the crosswalk. She pressed the button, waited for the light to change, and looked around idly, still humming to her song. Her eyes caught a group of kids riding bikes across the street, their laughter echoing. She smiled again. She liked seeing happy faces. It reminded her that life was good. Life was fair. Life was steady. But just beyond the corner, the officers noticed her. Their eyes followed her as she crossed, their expressions shifting. They saw only what they Wanted to see, not who she truly was. They didn't see a girl walking home from school. They didn't see a daughter humming to music. They didn't see the innocence of her day. They saw a target, and slowly. The ordinary day began to darken. She adjusted her headphones. Unaware of the eyes locked on her, she didn't know that her steps were being measured. Her presence being judged. She didn't know that the moment she turned down the next street, her peace would end. For now, she was still smiling faintly. Still thinking about nothing serious, still believing the day was hers to enjoy. She didn't realize she was walking straight into the beginning of a story that would change everything. She turned the corner, still humming softly, her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulder. To her, it was just another block on the way home. But for the two officers leaning against their squad car, it was the moment they decided to act. "Hey you, stop for a second," one of them called out. His voice carried the heavy tone of authority. Sharp and commanding. The girl froze, her music still playing faintly in her ears. She pulled one headphone down and looked back, her brows furrowing slightly. She wasn't sure if they were talking to her. "You," the officer repeated, pointing directly at her now. "Come here." Her heart skipped a beat, but she obeyed. Her parents had always told her to respect authority, to stay calm, never to argue. She walked toward them, her steps hesitant. Her eyes searched their faces, looking for some reason, any reason why they would call her. When she reached them, the taller officer crossed his arms, looking her up and down with a smirk that made her uneasy. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Home," she replied quietly, trying to sound steady. "From where?" The second officer added, his voice carrying suspicion. "From school," she said, pointing at her backpack as if that explained everything. But instead of easing, their expressions hardened. They exchanged a glance, the kind of silent communication that spoke of arrogance. One officer stepped closer, his shadow falling across her. "What's in the bag?" he demanded. "Books," she answered simply, clutching the strap tighter. "Mind if we check?" he asked, though it didn't sound like a question. His hand already moved as if to take the bag from her. She hesitated, her chest tightening. She had nothing to hide, but the way they asked, the way they looked at her, didn't feel right. Still, she remembered her father's words about staying calm. She nodded slowly. "Okay." The officer yanked the bag and unzipped it roughly, flipping through notebooks, pencils, and a half-eaten snack. His partner chuckled. "Yeah, dangerous stuff right here," he muttered sarcastically. Tossing the bag back toward her, it hit the ground at her feet, and her stomach twisted. Not from fear, but from humiliation. She bent to pick it up, keeping her eyes low, her hands trembled slightly. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but she swallowed her words, hoping the moment would end if she just stayed quiet. But it didn't. The taller officer circled her slowly, his eyes narrowing. "What are you really doing out here?" he pressed. "Girls like you don't just walk around for no reason." Her eyes snapped up, confusion flickering across her face. "Girls like me," she repeated softly. Her voice carried both innocence and the sting of insult. "Don't play dumb," the second officer said, his tone sharper now. "We've had trouble around here, and you look like you might know something." Her pulse quickened. She shook her head firmly. "I don't know anything. I was just going home. Please." But her politeness only seemed to fuel them. They stepped closer, invading her space. Their smirks turned to sneers, and their voices dropped low. "Carrying the weight of intimidation? You think you're smart, huh? Walking around like nothing's wrong, like you don't stand out." The words cut deeper than she expected. She wasn't sure what they wanted from her. Did they want fear? Did they want her to cry? She refused. She straightened her shoulders slightly, her eyes calm, though her body trembled inside. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said firmly. Her voice, though quiet, held dignity, and that dignity seemed to anger them. The taller officer laughed harshly. Hear that? She thinks she's innocent. He leaned closer, his breath hot. Everybody says that. Sweetheart. Her heart raced. Passers-by slowed, some glancing at the scene, but no one stepped in. Most lowered their eyes. Hurrying along, the girl felt the loneliness of the moment pressing down on her. She was surrounded by people. Yet completely alone, the second officer stepped behind her. His presence looming. Maybe we should take her in. Let her explain herself downtown. He suggested. His partner smirked. Yeah, maybe then she'll tell the truth. Fear surged in her chest, but she fought to stay steady. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Never let fear control you. Stay calm, stay strong. She clenched her fists slightly, not in defiance, but in strength. She would not let them see her break. She lifted her chin, her eyes meeting theirs with quiet courage. I didn't do anything, she repeated. Her tone was soft but unshaken. It wasn't a ply, was the truth. The officers exchanged another glance, their arrogance faltering for just a moment. They weren't used to calm resistance. They weren't used to dignity standing in the face of intimidation. It unsettled them, though they covered it with mocking laughter. Still, the moment dragged on, heavy and tense. The girl felt her chest tighten, her patience thinning. She realized then that no matter how polite she was, no matter how respectful, they would not back down. They weren't looking for truth. They were looking for control, and that was the moment her decision crystallized. Her fingers brushed her phone in her pocket. Her father's number sat on speed dial. She hesitated. Should she call? Should she bring him into this? She had always promised herself she wouldn't bother him with small problems. He was a busy man, a powerful man, someone whose work carried weight she didn't fully understand. But this wasn't small anymore. This was beyond humiliation, beyond intimidation. This was wrong. She closed her eyes briefly, drawing in a steady breath. Her father's words echoed again. If you're ever in trouble, don't hesitate. One call. That's all it takes. She opened her eyes, calm now, steady despite the storm inside her. The officers were still smirking, still circling, still believing. She was powerless, but they didn't know who she was. They didn't know the man standing silently behind her life. They didn't know that the ordinary girl they mocked carried the blood of a warrior feared by nations. Her hand tightened around her phone, and though she hadn't yet made the call, the decision was already made. The girl stood in front of the two officers, her backpack heavy on one shoulder, her phone warm in her pocket. Her heart was pounding. Hard, so loud she could hear it in her ears, but on the outside, she looked calm. Her face did not break, her eyes did not lower. She was scared, terrified even, but she refused to let them see it. The taller officer tilted his head, studying her with a smirk. What's with the attitude? You think you're too good to answer questions? His tone was mocking, filled with arrogance. The second officer leaned in from behind, his shadow stretching over her small frame. Yeah, she thinks she's tough, he added with a low chuckle. For a brief moment, her stomach twisted with fear. She wanted to run, but where would she go? She wanted to scream, but would anyone listen? Around her, people glanced but quickly turned away, choosing not to get involved. That was the hardest part, feeling invisible in plain sight. But she remembered her father's words he had repeated to her since she was young. True. Strength isn't in fists or loud voices. It's in keeping your dignity when others try to take it away. She held on to that thought tightly. Letting it steady her shaking hands, she drew a breath and spoke softly but clearly. I told you, I'm just going home from school. Her voice didn't tremble. It was calm, polite, almost gentle, but it carried truth, and truth has a weight that arrogance cannot crush so easily. The officers exchanged a glance, her composure irritating them more than if she had shouted. They were used to fear. two people panicking under their gaze. But here was a girl, barely grown, who answered with honesty instead of fear, dignity instead of submission. It unsettled them, though they didn't admit it. The taller one sneered, stepping even closer. "Don't get smart with us. We know kids like you, always acting innocent." His words dripped with accusation, but she didn't flinch. She looked him straight in the eyes, her gaze steady, not defiant, but firm. "I'm not acting," she said simply. "I am innocent." It was not the volume of her voice that carried power, but the quiet certainty in it. The kind of certainty that comes from knowing you've done nothing wrong. Her calmness frustrated them further. The second officer crossed his arms and leaned down, trying to tower over her. "You think you can just walk away? We decide what happens here, not you." His tone was harsh, meant to intimidate. But the girl's shoulders stayed square, her breathing steady. She had been taught not to crumble in the face of pressure, and she was clinging to that lesson. Now, with every ounce of courage inside, her fear was real. It crawled through her chest, tightening her throat, but she pushed it down, telling herself that fear was not weakness. Fear was a signal, one she could acknowledge but not obey, and so she stood there. Small against their size, but larger than they expected. The officers began circling her, their movements slow, calculated, their smirks widening when they saw that no one was stepping in. "You think anyone's gonna save you?" One of them muttered. His words hung in the air, sharp and cruel. Her lips pressed together, but she did not look away. Instead, she straightened her spine, lifted her chin slightly, and answered softly, "I don't need saving, because I haven't done anything." The words landed like a stone, surprising even herself for a moment. The officers fell silent, their mocking smirks faltered. They weren't expecting resistance. Not like this. They wanted panic, they wanted tears, but instead, they were met with quiet courage. One of them let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "She's got a mouth on her," he said. His partner chuckled, but the edge in their laughter revealed their discomfort. Her dignity was cutting through their arrogance. The girl could feel the tension shifting. It was still dangerous, still heavy. But she realized something important. She was not powerless. They might have uniforms and authority, but she had something they couldn't touch. Self-control. Her strength was not loud, not violent, but it was unshakable. She thought again of her father, of the times he had spoken to her about discipline, about keeping calm in the face of danger. He had once told her, "The strongest people are the ones who stay in control, even when the world tries to break them." And in that moment, she understood what he meant. Her quiet strength became her shield. The officers pushed, taunted, tried to provoke her, but she refused to give them what they wanted. Instead, she stood tall, eyes unwavering, her voice steady, repeating only the truth. "I didn't do anything. I just want to go home." Minutes dragged on like hours. The air around them felt thick, heavy with the weight of injustice, yet in the middle of it stood the girl. Calm as stone, fragile but unbroken. Her silence spoke louder than shouting ever could. People passing by began to notice more. Some slowed, some even recorded quietly on their phones. The sight of a young girl standing calm while two officers towered over her began to stir discomfort in the crowd. And though no one intervened, the shift in attention created cracks in the officers' arrogance. Still, they refused to let go. Their pride wouldn't allow them to back down. "You think you're brave, don't you?" The taller officer sneered. "You'll regret that." The girl's heart hammered. But her reply was simple. "I'm just telling the truth." That truth, quiet and steady, was a wall they couldn't break. For all their power, for all their threats, they were failing to shatter her dignity. And that was more humiliating to them than anything else. She didn't know it yet, but her quiet strength was more than just survival. It was the beginning of her father's storm. The officers thought they had cornered an easy target, but in reality, they were facing someone who had been raised by a man who knew the meaning of resilience. They didn't realize that the same quiet strength that unsettled them was the very blood of the Delta Force commander who would soon arrive. And so, she stood there in silence, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, her eyes locked on theirs, refusing to break. The ordinary girl they thought they could harass had shown them something they weren't prepared for: courage without noise, power without anger, strength without violence. The street felt colder now. Though the sun still hung above the rooftops, the girl stood firm, her calmness like a wall they could not climb, and that only made the officers angrier. They weren't used to this. They were used to fear in people's eyes, quick apologies, and shaky voices, but she gave them none of that. She stood quiet, steady, her gaze locked, her words few but sharp with truth. The taller officer scowled. Stepping even closer, his boots heavy on the pavement, he leaned down so his face was only inches from hers. "You think this is a game?" he hissed. His voice was low, dripping with threat. The girl's pulse jumped, but her expression didn't change. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said calmly. Her quiet reply struck him harder than a shout would have. His jaw clenched. His pride stung. He wanted to break her composure, to see her flinch. But she refused to give him that satisfaction. His partner, noticing his frustration, circled around behind her again, closing her in like prey. Now the intimidation was obvious. Deliberate, passers-by slowed, their eyes darting nervously toward the scene. Some muttered under their breath. Others kept walking quickly, unwilling to intervene. The girl felt their eyes, but they offered no protection. She was still alone between the two men towering over her. "Empty your pockets," the second officer barked suddenly. She blinked, confused. "Why?" she asked softly. "Because I told you to," he snapped. "What are you hiding?" Her hands trembled slightly at her sides. She wanted to protest, but her father's words echoed in her mind again. "Don't argue. Don't give them excuses. Stay calm." Slowly, she pulled out her phone and a few crumpled bills, placing them in her palm for him to see. The officer snatched the phone, turning it over, inspecting it as if it held secrets. "What's the passcode?" he demanded. She hesitated. "It's my phone," she said quietly. "There's nothing. Don't talk back," he barked. The words echoed down the street, sharp and ugly. Her chest tightened. She felt anger rising inside her now, hot and strong, but she swallowed it. She knew if she snapped, they would twist it against her. Instead, she said nothing, her silence deliberate, her eyes steady, her quiet strength unsettled them again. The taller officer reached for her backpack, yanking it roughly from her shoulder. This time, she stepped back quickly, her voice breaking through. "Stop, that's mine." It was the first crack in her calm, but it wasn't fear, was protest. Dignity fighting back, he sneered, holding the bag high. "What's the matter? Afraid we'll find something?" He shook it, papers and pens spilling slightly from the zipper. "Books, snacks, that's all?" he said mockingly, tossing it back to her feet. The humiliation burned inside her chest. But she bent down, picked it up quietly, and stood tall, again refusing to let him see her break. Her silence only fueled their arrogance. The second officer muttered, "She's too calm, acting like she's smarter than us." His partner smirked bitterly. "Maybe we should take her in. Teach her a lesson." Her stomach knotted. Fear pressed against her chest. But she stood her ground. Her voice was soft but firm. "I didn't do anything wrong. You can't." The taller officer laughed harshly. "Can't. We can do whatever we want." His words sliced through the air, cruel and heavy. He stepped closer again, his presence suffocating. "Out here, we're in charge. You're nothing but a kid walking alone." The girl felt her throat tighten. tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She fought them back fiercely, refusing to let them fall. She remembered her father's training, not physical training, but the lessons of discipline. Crying doesn't make you weak. But sometimes they'll see it as surrender, hold it in, and you stay in control. So she blinked quickly. Swallowing her tears, she looked straight at the officer, her small voice carrying more weight than they expected. "You're wrong," she said quietly, almost like a whisper, but powerful in its certainty. The smirk faded for a moment, replaced by something else: confusion, unease he wasn't expecting. That, his partner scoffed, trying to cover the tension. "Wrong. You're telling us we're wrong." Her lips pressed together, but she nodded slightly, not as defiance, but as truth. That nod, simple and calm, cut deeper than any shout could have. The street around them grew heavier. A couple of bystanders had pulled out their phones, holding them low but recording. The officers noticed, their arrogance wavering. But pride is a dangerous thing. It pushed them further. Refusing to back down even when eyes were watching, the taller officer grabbed her wrist suddenly, not rough enough to leave a mark, but tight enough to make her flinch. "Maybe you'll talk different downtown," he muttered. His partner chuckled darkly. "Yeah, let's take her for a ride." Her chest heaved now, panic fighting against her calm. Her father's number burned in her mind. Her phone was still in the officer's hand, but she had memorized the way to reach him. She clenched her teeth, refusing to cry out, refusing to beg. And then something changed in her eyes. A spark lit there, a reminder that she was not alone. Not really. She might look like just a girl to them, but behind her stood someone they didn't know. Someone whose shadow stretched farther than their authority ever could. She drew in a slow breath, her voice steady despite the grip on her wrist. "I told you I didn't do anything, and you'll regret this." The words stunned them, soft as they were. They weren't the words of a terrified teenager. They were the words of someone with quiet confidence. Someone who knew she carried protection they couldn't see. The officers exchanged a look, their arrogance cracking slightly under the weight of her composure. They still didn't know who she was. They still thought she was just another girl they could push around. But something in her tone unsettled them, as if she knew something they didn't, and she did. Her father's face flashed in her mind, the calm authority in his eyes, the steel in his voice, the strength in his silence. She held on to that image tightly, letting it keep her steady as the situation escalated. They thought they were in control, but the truth was already slipping through their fingers. The escalation wasn't just theirs, it was hers too. She was no longer just defending herself. She was preparing, quietly, for the moment that would change everything. Her wrist still ached from the officer's grip, though he had finally let go when passersby started staring more openly. She rubbed the spot gently, hiding the pain behind her calm face. The officers were restless now, pacing around her like wolves circling prey. Their arrogance hadn't faded, but something in her steady gaze unsettled them. Still, they didn't back down. Pride and ego pushed them forward. "Move," the taller officer barked. "We're taking you downtown." His voice carried authority, but also impatience. The girl's heart pounded hard. Louder than the traffic around them, she could feel the moment tightening like a rope. She was losing time, losing space. Soon, they might shove her into the car, and then she'd be trapped completely. Her fingers twitched at her side, brushing against her pocket where her second phone rested. The first one was still in the officer's hand, but she always carried a backup, a simple phone. Her father insisted she keep with her at all times. "For emergencies only," he had said. His voice echoed in her head now, steady and commanding. "If you ever feel cornered, call me. Don't hesitate." She hesitated anyway, for just a second. Doubt crept in. What if he thought she was overreacting? What if he was too far away? What if this only made things worse? But then the officer's voice cut through her thoughts. "Hurry up, we don't have all day." And in that instant, her hesitation vanished. She slipped her hand into her pocket and wrapped her fingers around the phone. The cool plastic felt. Like Lifeline, she took a steady breath, her face still calm, and pressed the number she had memorized since she was old enough to carry a phone. The line rang once, twice, her chest tightened. Then she heard it's the low, steady voice of her father, sweetheart. Her throat nearly closed with relief. "Dad," she whispered, her voice low. "I need you." There was silence on the other end, but not the silence of doubt. It was the silence of a man who understood instantly. His voice dropped lower, harder. "Where are you?" She gave the location quickly, her voice trembling now for the first time. But steady enough to be clear. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand details. He only said 4 words. Words that made her heart steady again. "Stay right where you are." The officer holding her other phone sneered when he noticed her whispering. "Who are you calling, huh? Your little friends." He tried to snatch the phone, but she pulled back, her eyes sharper now. "No," she said firmly, louder this time. "I'm calling my father." The words seemed to amuse him. He laughed, shaking his head. "What's Daddy gonna do? Ground us?" His partner chuckled too. The arrogance dripped from them like oil. They had no idea. But her voice didn't waver. She looked them straight in the eye. "You'll find out." The minutes that followed stretched long. The officers kept mocking her, throwing threats, circling closer, but something inside her had shifted. She wasn't just enduring anymore. She was waiting. The fear that had tightened her chest was slowly replaced by anticipation, by a quiet certainty that the balance was about to change, and then it did. The low growl of engines broke the air first. Black SUVs turned onto the street, sleek, tinted, moving with precision. They didn't belong to neighbors, didn't belong to passersby. The officers frowned, confusion flickering in their eyes. They weren't used to seeing vehicles like that pull up in this quiet neighborhood. The SUVs stopped sharply, doors opening in unison. Men stepped out. Dressed not in police uniforms, but in dark tactical gear. Their movements were sharp, controlled, disciplined. The air around them shifted instantly, heavy with authority, and then he stepped out. Her father, his presence was quiet, but terrifying. His frame tall, his posture unshakable. His eyes sharp as steel swept the scene in a single glance. In that moment, the entire street seemed to fall silent. The girl's chest loosened with relief. Her father's gaze softened only when it landed on her. He walked toward her each step deliberate, controlled, his voice calm but carrying the weight of command as he asked, "Are you all right?" She nodded quickly, her lips trembling. "Yes, Dad," she whispered. The sound of that single word made the officers stiffen. Something about the way she said it, the way he responded, made them uneasy. "Who are you?" The taller officer demanded, his arrogance faltering slightly. He tried to sound authoritative, but his voice cracked at the edges. The father turned his gaze on them, cold and steady. It was the look of a man who had seen war, who had led men into battles most could not imagine, who had earned fear without raising his voice. "The wrong man for you to cross," he said simply. The officers shifted uncomfortably, but their pride clung desperately. She was resisting. One stammered, "We were just doing our job." Her father's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't shout, didn't curse. He simply stepped closer. His presence alone enough to make them step back. "You laid hands on my daughter," he said quietly, dangerously calm, "and you dared to mock her." His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of thunder. The officers swallowed hard, realizing too late that this was not a man they could intimidate, not a man they could dismiss. Behind him, his men stood silently, their eyes sharp, their stance firm. They didn't Need to speak. Their presence was warning enough. The girl felt her knees weaken, but not from fear this time, from relief, from the knowledge that she was safe now, truly safe. She stood taller, her quiet strength now reinforced by the storm that had arrived in her father's shadow. The taller officer tried again, his voice shaking. Look. We didn't know. Her father cut him off with a single glance. That's the problem, he said. You never know who you're dealing with. And you never thought you needed to. You thought she was powerless. Silence fell heavy on the street. The bystanders who had recorded earlier now held their phones higher, capturing every moment. The officers looked smaller now, their arrogance crumbling into fear. The girl looked at them too, her eyes steady, no longer just calm, but victorious in her quiet way. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to gloat. Her father's presence had said everything. That one call had changed everything. Asterix engines rumbled low, like thunder rolling across the street. The black SUVs that had pulled up seemed to silence the entire neighborhood. Their presence was commanding, sleek, and deliberate, like shadows that had taken shape. Doors opened in unison, and men stepped out with the precision of soldiers. Every move was calculated. Sharp, quiet, but dangerous. The two officers who had harassed the girl froze where they stood. Their smirks disappeared. Their shoulders stiffened. They weren't facing ordinary backup. They were facing something else entirely, something that radiated discipline and power in a way their badges never could. And then her father emerged. The late afternoon light caught his figure as he stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, his stride measured and confident. His presence was not loud, but it didn't need to be. Authority seemed to walk with him. The men behind him, dressed in dark tactical gear, fell into step like a protective wall, silent but ready. The girl's breath caught in her chest. Relief washed over her as soon as she saw him. She had been holding herself steady for so long. But in that moment, seeing his familiar face, the weight of fear lifted. He walked toward her first, his eyes softening only when they met hers. You okay? His voice was calm, but beneath it was steel. She nodded quickly, her lips trembling. Yes, Dad, she whispered. It was all she needed to say. And it was all he needed to hear. His gaze swept over her, briefly taking in the tension in her stance, the way she clutched her backpack, the faint redness where the officer had gripped her wrist. His jaw tightened. The taller officer tried to clear his throat, forcing his voice steady. Look, sir. We were just, but her father's eyes cut to him, cold, sharp, like a blade. The officer stopped mid-sentence. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Her father took another step forward, his men fanning slightly, forming a subtle wall behind him. Their presence made the street feel smaller, tighter. Their eyes locked onto the officers, watching every movement. It was clear now this was not an ordinary man, and these were not ordinary soldiers. The second officer swallowed hard, but pride clung to him desperately. We were just questioning her routine procedure, he stammered, trying to justify himself. His words sounded weak, flimsy against the quiet storm standing before him. Her father's voice was low, measured, but it carried the weight of command forged in years of war. Routine procedure doesn't include intimidation, he said. Routine procedure doesn't include laying hands on my daughter. His tone never rose, but each word landed heavy. Unshakable, the taller officer stepped back slightly, his confidence draining. He had thought he held power a moment ago, but power had shifted completely. It wasn't in their uniforms anymore. It wasn't in their raised voices. It was in the calm, terrifying presence of the man standing before them. The girl watched silently, her heart steady now. She had carried herself with quiet strength, but now she didn't have to stand alone. Our father's presence wrapped around her like armor, protecting her, shielding her, reminding her that she was not powerless. Bystanders had gathered in the distance, phones out, recording. The sight of the black SUVs and the disciplined soldiers had drawn attention. Whispers ran through the crowd. Who is he? What's going on? No one knew the full answer. But they could feel if this was a man who commanded respect. Her father stepped closer still, now only inches from the officers. His eyes never wavered. You thought she was powerless, he said quietly. You thought she was just another girl to push around. His words were calm, but underneath was fury. Restrained and sharp. You didn't know who she was, and that was your mistake. The officers shifted nervously, their earlier arrogance melting into fear. The taller one's voice cracked as he tried to defend himself. We didn't mean any harm. We didn't know. That's the problem, her father cut in. You never know who you're dealing with. That's why you treat every person with respect, no matter what. But you didn't. You chose arrogance. You chose intimidation. The silence that followed was suffocating. The only sound was the hum of engines still running, the faint clicking of phones recording. The officers' pride fought to hold. But their fear betrayed them. Their shoulders slumped. Their voices fell quiet. Their power was gone. Her father finally turned his gaze away from them and looked at his daughter again. His eyes softened just slightly. Go stand with the car. He told her gently. She obeyed, walking toward the SUVs. Her steps were steady. Though her knees trembled with the release of tension, one of his men opened a door for her, standing protectively as she moved behind the wall of soldiers. Now her father turned back fully to the officers. His voice dropped lower, darker. If you ever lay a hand on her again, he said, each word cutting like ice, you won't. Just answer to the loyal. Answer to me. The officers' faces drained of color. They didn't ask who he was. They didn't need to. The weight of his words, the presence of the soldiers, the fear that pressed into their chest was enough. They understood. Her father held their gaze for another long moment, then finally stepped back, turning toward his men with a subtle hand signal. They moved with him, forming a shield around him as they returned to the SUVs. The entire movement was silent, coordinated, flawless. The girl watched from the back seat of the SUV, her heart full of relief and awe. The officers who had mocked her minutes ago now stood frozen, silent, broken of their arrogance. She realized then that the call she had made wasn't just to her father, it was to power, to justice, to protection that no badge could ever match. The engines roared softly as the SUVs prepared to pull away through the tinted glass. She could still see the officers standing on the street, their pride stripped, their confidence shattered. They had harassed the wrong girl, and now they knew it. Her father sat beside her, his presence calm again. He didn't speak immediately. He only placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that said everything. You're safe. I'm here. They'll never touch you again. And as the SUVs rolled forward, the girl leaned back into the seat, finally allowing herself to exhale fully. The day had begun ordinary, but now it was forever changed. One call had brought her father. One arrival had shifted power. And nothing would ever be the same again. Asterisk. The black SUVs idled at the curb, their engines low and steady, like the growl of something powerful waiting to strike. The girl sat in the back seat, her breath finally even, her eyes watching through the tinted glass as her father stood on the street. He had not raised his voice. He had not moved with violence. And yet, the two officers looked as though the ground beneath them had vanished. Her father didn't leave immediately. He wasn't a man who walked away from unfinished business. The quiet calm in his stance was more terrifying than shouting ever could be. He had spent a lifetime commanding men in the world's most dangerous places, and now that same command filled this small neighborhood street. The taller officer swallowed hard, his throat dry. Sir, it was just a misunderstanding, he said weakly. His earlier arrogance had melted completely. His words stumbled over themselves. Desperate to explain away his actions, her father stepped closer, his boots steady, each movement deliberate. His eyes narrowed as he studied them. Not as men, but as problems, a misunderstanding. He repeated. His voice was soft, but the weight behind it pressed into the air like a storm cloud. You stopped her, he continued, his tone measured. You questioned her without cause. You put your hands on her. You mocked her, each. Word was spoken like a verdict, sharp and undeniable. That is not a misunderstanding. That is abuse. The second officer tried to interrupt. We were just doing our job, but his voice faltered under the commander's gaze. The words died in his throat. Her father's silence cut deeper than any argument. He simply stood there, his eyes fixed, unblinking. The men behind him, his soldiers, remained perfectly still, their posture straight, their presence heavy. The message was clear. This wasn't just a father defending his child. This was a commander delivering judgment. The girl could see the officers shift nervously, their hands twitching at their sides. They weren't used to being the ones cornered. They weren't used to being on the receiving end of power. But that's exactly where they were now. Her father finally spoke again. You thought she was weak. You thought she was alone, and that gave you courage. But courage born from arrogance isn't real. It collapses the moment it's challenged. His voice was steady, deep, each word hitting like a hammer.